What did you make of him in the beginning? Did you think he had the stuff?
Well, I thought he had one of the best teams I'd ever seen around him. Mike Deaver told me during the week that Ronald Reagan was being remembered, that at one point Richard Nixon called Reagan to a suite and said, "You know, young man, you'll get your chance at some point." And Reagan leaned over and said, "I'm 3 years older than you are, actually, Mr. Nixon," which is true. And Nixon then went on to win the nomination, but he had a deal with Ronald Reagan all along the way, and they knew at that point what a formidable force he was going to be. I've been covering Ronald Reagan since 1966, and I never, ever underestimated his ability to be a great, successful warrior on Election Day. He had an uncanny connection to the American public. It was part philosophy, part personality, a lot of optimism, and he was unapologetic in his kind of view of this country. He really did think that it was a city shining on the hill, and that if you stay with me, we can get there together.
What do you think about the future in terms of the Reagan legacy?
The progeny of Ronald Reagan don't necessarily carry his name. There's a whole generation of young conservatives out there in office, commentators and others who got involved in politics because of what he meant to them. He had as much of an impact, I believe, on succeeding populations in terms of American politics as John Kennedy did. Right. You know, the number of people that are my age who say, I got into politics because of John Kennedy, sure, or I was drawn to public service because of John Kennedy. Succeeding generations came along and said it was Ronald Reagan who got me into the arena. And they're there in Congress, in the United States Senate. They're working on television, they're writing columns, they're everywhere.
Much more to come when our special Picking Our Presidents returns.
And with George McGovern as President of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago.
Tom, remember, we're going to talk a little bit about the great speeches you can recall, the ones that grabbed you. Let's talk about the real disasters, the Goldwater speech.
Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice.
I was working in Omaha, which was a very conservative city at the time, and the station which I was working at, a lot of Goldwater acolytes, I guess you probably best describe them. And I found that convention, politics aside, unsettling.
Repudiate here and now any doctrine, any doctrinaire militant minority, whether communist, Ku Klux Klan, or Bircher.
Because it was so mean-spirited, it was so dark in so many ways. You know, that convention played to the party loyalties of the conservative wing of the party, and it may have made them feel good, but it didn't reach out from the Cow Palace in San Francisco to the rest of the country that they had to win. Now, you know, the irony it is, when I got to know Barry Goldwater personally, I covered his speeches in other places, he was the single most charming man I think I'd ever met in American politics. He was just great.
Was he unfairly made the hobgoblin by the media, or was he sticking it back to his critics by saying, all right, you want me to say it, I'll say it. Extremism in defense of liberty is no vice. Take it.
I think he strongly felt that way.
Yeah.
In your heart, you know he's right. All of those things. That was really the birth of the modern conservative movement within the Republican Party, but it required Ronald Reagan to give it the kind of voice that America welcomed and to be more pragmatic about it. It seemed more exclusionary when Barry Goldwater was saying it than it did when Ronald Reagan was saying it.
John Chancellor is down on the floor with some further information. John,
and also in that '64 convention, NBC's John Chancellor was escorted off the floor.
We were waiting to do an interview in the Alaska delegation, and two of the sergeant's arms came along and said, you'll have to clear the aisle. And we said we were working, and they said that didn't make any difference to them. Here we go, down the middle aisle. I formally say that this is a disgrace, that the press should be allowed and the radio and television should be allowed to do their work at a convention on television. This is John Chancellor somewhere in custody.
That was a hell of a moment for television, wasn't it? The television correspondent yanked off the floor.
I was not working at NBC in those days. I was working still in Omaha, but I was in awe of John's presence of mind to say reporting from somewhere in custody. He was always so cool about everything, and he did that great play-by-play as he was led off the floor and then reporting from somewhere in custody, and it stayed with him to the very end of his life.
Do you think that might have been one time that the people out there, even the conservatives, were rooting for the correspondent, maybe?
No, I don't think so.
No.
Not in that convention. Chet and David talked about it, about the hostility in the hall. They would stand up and point at them, and with threatening gestures.
This ugliness has persisted all week, and so it's just beginning to flare up down there on the floor.
The national conventions do more than pick our presidents. They chart the course for America's future. They set the agenda. They say what parties stand for and what they're willing to fight for. Sometimes it's the fight that's most remembered, like Chicago in 1968.
And now moving off down Balboa Street, and the crowd is running.
And with George McGovern as President of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago. How hard it is to accept the truth.
And he looked at Mayor Daley.
What a culture clash. There was Abe Ribicoff running for re-election in very anti-war liberal Connecticut, scoring points on Boss Daley. By the way, Daley's people say he never used the words that we can obviously hear him speaking there.
Billy Daley, his son, was sitting not too far behind him, and so was Richie Daley, who's now the mayor of Chicago, and they insist that the delegation was saying, "You think you," which was a great insult in Chicago. It was the single most memorable convention that I've ever been to for both good and bad purposes. You saw America at an intersection. I spent most of my time at that convention out on the streets with the demonstrators, and one night I walked between the protesters and the National Guardsmen. They were all the same age. And I thought, this is the dividing line of America. I mean, how are we going to survive this? And I went home to my parents, who were FDR working-class Democrats, and I thought that they would be very sympathetic to the demonstrators. We had a huge fight. My dad was outraged by the lack of respect for police and for the institutions of law in Chicago, and that was also a lesson to me about where we were in the country and how much trouble the Democrats were in.
I think every family in America had that fight.
Yeah.
Is that one of the conventions where the party actually came out worse off afterward than they were going in?
Oh, I don't think there's any question about that, but they did a pretty remarkable job of getting themselves repaired by the fall, and Humphrey was an indefatigable campaigner, and there were a lot of overtures toward peace with Vietnam, and that was making a difference, and they stitched the party together, because if anything could bring Democrats together, it was Richard Nixon.
Well, by 1972, they'd mastered the art of a disastrous convention. Still to come, a mismanaged convention that turned out to be a sign of the campaign to come.